There are places in this world that stand as monuments to human perseverance, structures that bear witness to the relentless passage of time while remaining steadfast in their purpose. Among these, few hold the mystique and enduring presence of the lighthouse, a solitary sentinel perched at the edge of land and sea, where the known world meets the vast unknown. This is the story of one such lighthouse, a tower that has burned through storm and silence, through war and peace, through generations of keepers who devoted their lives to a flame that would never be allowed to die. It is a story that spans more than 2 centuries, a chronicle of dedication that transcends the individual lives that sustained it, a testament to the belief that some lights must never go dark, no matter the cost. The lighthouse stands on a promontory of jagged rock, where cliffs rise 70 meters above the churning waters below, a location chosen not for its beauty, but for its brutal necessity. Here, where currents collide and winds howl with a fury that seems born of the depths themselves, ships have met their end since the first vessels dared to navigate these treacherous passages. The seafloor beneath these waters is a graveyard of wooden hulls and iron dreams, of cargo holds filled with goods that would never reach their destinations, of sailors whose final moments were consumed by the roar of waves against stone. It was to prevent such tragedies that the lighthouse was first proposed in the year 1798, though it would take nearly 4 years of debate, planning and preparation before the first stone was laid. The man who championed its construction was a maritime engineer named Marcus Aldworth, a figure whose obsession with coastal safety had been forged in personal tragedy when his younger brother perished in a shipwreck along this very stretch of coastline during a winter storm. Aldworth spent 3 years surveying the site, calculating angles of visibility, studying tide patterns and wind velocities, determining the optimal height and position for a structure that could serve as a beacon visible from 15 nautical miles in clear weather. His final design called for a tower 42 meters tall, built from granite blocks hewn from quarries 30 kilometers inland, each block numbered and fitted with such precision that mortar would serve as reinforcement rather than necessity. The foundation alone required 18 months of labor, with workers suspended on rope scaffolding, drilling into living rock to create a base that would defy the erosive power of salt spray and storm surge for centuries to come. Construction was interrupted 7 times by weather severe enough to make work impossible, with waves reaching heights that submerged the partially built foundation under 6 meters of seawater, forcing crews to rebuild sections that had been damaged or swept away entirely. 23 workers sustained serious injuries during the construction, and 3 lost their lives, 2 to falls from the scaffolding, 1 to a massive wave that swept him from the foundation platform during what had seemed to be a routine day of work. Their names were carved into a bronze plaque that would later be mounted in the lighthouse keeper's quarters, a somber reminder that the tower itself was built on sacrifice. The lighthouse was finally completed in 1802, with its first lighting ceremony attended by over 400 people who made the arduous journey to the remote promontory to witness the moment when the great oil lamp was ignited for the first time. The light source was revolutionary for its era, a system of multiple oil lamps arranged around a central axis, backed by parabolic reflectors made of silver-plated copper that concentrated and amplified the light into a beam powerful enough to penetrate fog and darkness. The beam rotated once every 40 seconds, its distinctive pattern serving as a navigational signature that experienced sailors could identify from other lighthouses along the coast. The first keeper appointed to maintain this light was a former naval officer named Thomas Brennan, a man of 52 who had spent 30 years at sea before injury sustained during a storm forced him to seek work on land. Brennan approached his new role with the same discipline he had applied to military service, establishing routines and protocols that would become the foundation for every keeper who followed. He rose each morning before dawn, inspecting the lamp mechanism for any sign of wear or malfunction, cleaning the glass panels of the lantern room until they gleamed with perfect transparency, trimming wicks and measuring fuel levels, recording weather conditions and passing ships in a leather-bound log that he maintained with meticulous care. The life of a lighthouse keeper was one of profound isolation, particularly in those early years when the nearest settlement was a full day's journey by horse and cart along roads that became impassable during winter months. Brennan lived in quarters built into the base of the tower, 3 small rooms that served as bedroom, kitchen, and workshop, their stone walls 2 meters thick to withstand the constant assault of wind and sea. He had no family, having never married, and his only companions were the seabirds that nested in the cliffs below, and a cat named Admiral who had wandered to the lighthouse during the first month of Brennan's tenure and stayed for the next 14 years. The keeper's duties extended far beyond simply maintaining the light. He was responsible for monitoring weather patterns and recording atmospheric conditions, providing rescue assistance to shipwreck survivors when possible, maintaining the tower's structural integrity, and managing the complex logistics of supply deliveries that arrived irregularly depending on weather and sea conditions. Every 2 weeks during fair weather, a supply boat would arrive carrying oil for the lamps, food provisions, letters and newspapers, and occasionally visitors who wished to see the lighthouse or conduct official inspections. During winter storms, weeks could pass between deliveries, requiring the keeper to maintain supplies sufficient for extended isolation. Brennan kept extensive reserves of lamp oil stored in sealed copper tanks, knowing that running out of fuel would be an unthinkable dereliction of duty that could cost lives. The lighthouse proved its worth within months of operation, as ship captains began reporting successful navigations through waters that had previously claimed vessels with disturbing regularity. The insurance companies that underwrote maritime cargo noticed the change immediately, with the rate of losses in the region dropping by nearly 60% within the first year after the lighthouse became operational. Letters of gratitude arrived at the Maritime Authority offices from captains who had been guided safely through storms. From families whose loved ones had returned home because they could navigate treacherous waters with confidence, from merchants whose goods reached market intact. But the lighthouse also bore witness to tragedies it could not prevent, as even the most powerful light cannot overcome human error, mechanical failure, or the sheer overwhelming force of nature at its most violent. Thomas Brennan recorded in his log the night of November 14, 1807, when a merchant vessel ignored the lighthouse's warning and attempted to navigate too close to the rocks during a severe gale. He watched helplessly from the lantern room as the ship was driven onto the reef, its hull torn open, its crew struggling in waves that rose like mountains in the darkness. Brennan descended from the tower carrying rope and lamp, making his way down the treacherous cliff path in howling wind and driving rain, but by the time he reached the waterline, there was no one left to save. 17 men were lost that night, and Brennan spent the following days recovering bodies that washed ashore, burying them in the rocky soil behind the lighthouse, marking their grave with stones. The psychological toll of such experiences weighed heavily on those who kept the light, as they were both saviors and witnesses to salvation they could not always provide. Brennan served as keeper for 18 years, until age and declining health finally forced him to retire. His replacement was a younger man named David Carrick, age 37, who arrived with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, transforming the isolated lighthouse into something approaching a family home. The Maritime Authority had by this time constructed a larger keeper's dwelling adjacent to the tower, a 2-story house that provided more comfortable accommodations for families. Margaret Carrick adapted to the isolation with remarkable resilience, homeschooling the children using books delivered with supplies, maintaining a vegetable garden in soil she improved with seaweed and composted kitchen waste, and assisting her husband with lighthouse duties when needed. The children, 2 boys and a girl, aged 9, 7 and 5 when they arrived, grew up in an environment utterly unlike that of their peers in distant cities and towns. Their playground was the windswept promontory, their companions were seabirds and seals. Their education included practical lessons in weather prediction, maritime navigation, and mechanical maintenance alongside traditional academics. The eldest boy, Jonathan, showed particular aptitude for the technical aspects of lighthouse keeping, and by age 14 was assisting his father with lamp maintenance and repairs. It was during the Carrick family's tenure that the lighthouse faced its first major crisis, an event that would become legendary among keepers and would establish precedents for emergency protocols that remain relevant to this day. The date was March 9, 1828, and a storm of unprecedented ferocity had been building for 3 days, with barometric pressure dropping to levels David Carrick had never witnessed. By the evening of the 9th, winds exceeded 140 kilometers per hour, with waves reaching heights estimated at 20 meters or more, sending spray high enough to coat the lantern room glass with salt despite its elevation 42 meters above sea level. At approximately 9 in the evening, a particularly massive wave struck the lighthouse with such force that the entire structure shuddered, and David heard a sound that filled him with dread, the grinding crack of stone under stress. He immediately sent Margaret and the children to the most protected room in the dwelling, then ascended to the lantern room to assess the damage. What he found made his blood run cold. The impact had cracked several of the glass panels protecting the lamp, and seawater was spraying into the chamber with each subsequent wave, threatening to extinguish the light. David knew that if the light went dark during this storm, any ships attempting to navigate these waters would be doomed, their captains having no way to know they were heading directly for the rocks. Working alone in conditions that would be considered suicidal by any reasonable measure, David rigged a system of canvas tarps to shield the lamp from the spray while still allowing light to pass through. The tarps were repeatedly torn away by wind, forcing him to replace them again and again throughout the night, his hands raw and bleeding from handling the frozen, salt-encrusted canvas. At one point, a wave surge filled the lantern room with knee-deep water, and David had to work frantically to keep the lamp mechanism above the flood, standing on a chair while holding the lamp assembly steady as water drained through the floor grates. The ordeal continued for 6 hours before the storm began to abate, and when dawn finally broke, David Carrick had been awake for more than 30 hours straight, his clothing frozen to his body, suffering from exposure that would leave him with permanent damage to his extremities. But the light had never gone dark, not for a single minute, and 3 ships that had been caught in the storm later reported that the lighthouse beacon had been their only reference point, the sole reason they had survived the night. David's actions that night earned him official recognition and a commendation from the Maritime Authority, but more importantly, they established a culture among lighthouse keepers that would endure for generations. The light must never go dark, regardless of personal cost, regardless of danger, regardless of circumstance. The story of that night was passed down through decades, becoming part of the lighthouse's identity, a standard against which all subsequent keepers would measure themselves. The Carrick family served for 23 years before Jonathan, now a young man of 32, formally assumed the position of keeper from his retiring father, making him the 3rd keeper in the lighthouse's history, and the first who had essentially grown up within its walls. Jonathan married a woman named Elizabeth who had no prior experience with lighthouse life, but who embraced it with determination, and together they raised 4 children in the keeper's dwelling. It was during Jonathan's tenure that significant technological improvements began to transform lighthouse operations. In 1843, the old oil lamp system was replaced with a new Fresnel lens apparatus, a revolutionary optical system designed by a master craftsman that used a complex arrangement of prisms and lenses to magnify and focus light with unprecedented efficiency. The new system was so effective that it increased the lighthouse's visible range from 15 to 24 nautical miles, while actually using less fuel than the old lamps. The installation required 6 weeks of careful work, with Jonathan learning to maintain and adjust the delicate lens system, which rotated on a precisely engineered clockwork mechanism powered by descending weights that had to be wound every 4 hours. The improvement in light output was dramatic enough that ship captains began reporting they could see the beam in conditions that would have rendered the old light invisible, and the already impressive safety record of the waters around the lighthouse improved even further. Jonathan Carrick proved to be not only a capable keeper, but an innovator who made numerous improvements to the lighthouse operations. He installed a rainwater collection system that reduced dependence on delivered water supplies, designed a more efficient storage system for lamp fuel that reduced fire risk, and established a detailed record-keeping system that tracked maintenance tasks, weather patterns, and ship traffic with such thoroughness that his logs became reference documents consulted by maritime authorities when planning coastal navigation improvements. He also began the tradition of maintaining a rescue equipment cache, including ropes, life rings, blankets, and medical supplies, positioned at strategic points along the cliff path so that assistance could be provided to shipwreck survivors more quickly and effectively. These preparations proved their worth on multiple occasions, most notably during a winter storm in 1851, when a passenger vessel ran aground on the reef during a blinding snow squall. Jonathan and his 2 eldest sons, working in conditions of extreme cold and danger, managed to rig a rope system that allowed them to extract 12 survivors from the wreckage before the ship broke apart completely. Rescue effort took 9 hours, and one of Jonathan's sons, Michael, suffered severe frostbite that resulted in the loss of 3 fingers on his left hand, but 12 people who would otherwise have perished lived to tell the story of the lighthouse keeper and his sons who risked everything to save them. As the decades passed, the lighthouse became more than just a navigational aid. It became a symbol, a landmark known to every sailor who traveled these waters, a reassuring constant in the ever-changing sea. Ship captains would point it out to first-time passengers, parents would tell children stories about the keepers who lived there, and the lighthouse began to appear in paintings and sketches, in poems and songs, in the collective imagination of maritime culture. Yet for those who actually lived and worked there, the reality remained one of unrelenting duty, of days that blended into one another in an endless cycle of maintenance and vigilance, of isolation that could be both peaceful and maddening depending on one's disposition. The lighthouse keeper's life demanded a particular type of person, someone who could find satisfaction in routine, who could endure solitude without succumbing to loneliness, who could maintain unwavering discipline even when no one was watching, who could face danger with calm competence, and who genuinely believed that their work mattered in a profound and meaningful way. Not everyone possessed these qualities, and the Maritime Authority learned through experience that selecting the right keeper was as important as the engineering of the lighthouse itself. Jonathan Carrick served for 31 years before age and declining health forced him to retire in 1874, making him the longest-serving keeper to that date. His replacement was a man named William Thatcher, age 41, who had served as assistant keeper at another lighthouse for 7 years before accepting the head keeper position. Thatcher arrived with his wife Catherine and their 2 daughters, and he brought with him a reputation for exceptional technical skill and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Under Thatcher's care, the lighthouse operated with mechanical precision, with maintenance logs so detailed they noted the exact number of times the lens required cleaning each day, the precise amount of fuel consumed each night, and observations about even minor changes in the equipment's performance. This meticulous approach served him well in 1882, when he noticed a subtle change in the sound of the lens rotation mechanism, a barely perceptible grinding that other keepers might have ignored or attributed to normal variation. Thatcher disassembled the entire clockwork mechanism, discovering that a critical gear was developing stress fractures that would have resulted in catastrophic failure within days, potentially leaving the lighthouse unable to produce its characteristic rotating beam. He fabricated a replacement gear using tools in his workshop, a task that required 3 days of precise metalworking, and installed it just hours before the original gear failed completely during a routine inspection test. His vigilance had prevented a failure that could have resulted in maritime disaster, as a major storm arrived 2 days later and 6 vessels were navigating these waters during the tempest, all depending on the lighthouse's distinctive rotating signal to maintain safe distance from the rocks. The lighthouse community, a term that seems paradoxical given the isolation, but which accurately describes the network of keepers who shared experiences and knowledge despite rarely meeting in person, began to evolve during this period as new technologies enabled better communication. The installation of a telegraph line to the lighthouse in 1887 connected William Thatcher to the outside world in ways previous keepers could never have imagined, allowing him to report equipment issues, request supplies, and receive weather warnings with unprecedented speed. The telegraph also provided a psychological lifeline during the long winter months, offering daily proof that the lighthouse and its keepers had not been forgotten by the world beyond the promontory. Yet even as technology advanced, the fundamental nature of the keeper's duty remained unchanged. Every evening as darkness approached, the lamp must be lit, the lens must be cleaned and set in motion, the light must shine through the night until dawn made it unnecessary, and this cycle must repeat without fail, without exception, without compromise. The pattern of keeper succession continued into the 20th century, with each keeper serving for years or decades, each leaving their mark on the lighthouse's history, each adding to the collective knowledge and tradition that defined the role. The early 1900s brought further technological advancement, with the lighthouse receiving an upgraded lamp that used incandescent vapor rather than liquid fuel, producing an even brighter light while simplifying maintenance requirements. The new lamp was installed in 1909 by keeper Richard Pemberton, who had assumed the position 3 years earlier, and the installation marked the beginning of a new era in lighthouse operations. The vapor lamp required different maintenance protocols, and Pemberton spent weeks mastering the new system, consulting with engineers and studying technical manuals, determined to operate the equipment with the same reliability that had characterized the lighthouse since its founding. His dedication was tested in 1914 when a series of technical failures threatened to dark the light for the first time in its history. A fault in the vapor lamp system caused it to fail repeatedly, extinguishing without warning despite Pemberton's best efforts to diagnose and repair the problem. For 3 consecutive nights, he stayed in the lantern room continuously, relighting the lamp each time it failed, sometimes managing only minutes of operation before another failure occurred. Unable to solve the problem immediately and unwilling to leave the lighthouse dark, Pemberton retrieved the old oil lamp system that had been preserved in storage and installed it as an emergency backup, maintaining the light through traditional means while working during daylight hours to repair the vapor lamp. His resourcefulness and refusal to accept failure exemplified the keeper's ethos, and the story of those 3 days became another chapter in the lighthouse's growing legend. The years between 1914 and 1918 brought unprecedented challenges as global conflict transformed the seas from highways of commerce into theaters of warfare. The lighthouse, which had always been a symbol of safety, suddenly became a strategic asset, with its light serving to guide not only merchant vessels but military ships as well. Keeper Pemberton received orders to modify the lighthouse operation protocols, implementing a system where the light could be quickly extinguished if enemy vessels were detected in the area, then just as quickly relit once the threat passed. This placed enormous additional stress on Pemberton, who now had to monitor not only equipment and weather, but also military communications, making rapid decisions about whether to maintain or extinguish the light based on tactical considerations. On 7 separate occasions during the conflict, he darkened the lighthouse, waiting in tense silence as hostile vessels passed within sight of the promontory, then relit the beacon once they had moved beyond the area. The psychological burden of these experiences was severe, as Pemberton grappled with the reality that his light, intended solely for preservation of life, had become entangled in a conflict where the goal was often the opposite. He recorded in his logs a profound moral struggle with these contradictions, writing at one point that he felt he had betrayed the fundamental purpose of the lighthouse by allowing military considerations to override the absolute commitment to keeping the light burning. Despite these conflicts, Pemberton never abandoned his post and maintained the lighthouse through 4 years of warfare, earning respect from both maritime and military authorities for his steadfast service under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. When peace finally returned, the lighthouse resumed its purely civilian role, and Pemberton remained as keeper until 1928, when he retired after 24 years of service. The interwar years saw the lighthouse continue its evolution, with improvements to the keeper's dwelling making life somewhat more comfortable, including installation of an electrical generator that provided power for lighting and equipment in the residence, though the main lighthouse lamp remained independent of this system to ensure reliability. The position of lighthouse keeper, which had once been viewed as a hardship posting, now attracted applicants who saw in it an opportunity for a life less hectic than the increasingly industrialized society developing in urban centers. Men who had survived the trauma of warfare sometimes sought the isolation and routine of lighthouse keeping as a form of healing, finding in the daily rituals and clear purpose a structure that helped them process their experiences. Such was the case with keeper Edmund Cross, who assumed the position in 1929, a veteran who spoke little of his war experiences, but who found in lighthouse keeping a vocation that gave him peace. Cross served through the 1930s, a decade of economic hardship in many parts of the world, but the lighthouse remained largely insulated from these troubles, its operations funded by maritime authorities who understood that navigation safety was not optional regardless of economic conditions. Cross maintained the lighthouse with quiet competence, raising 3 children with his wife Dorothy, the children growing up much as previous generations of lighthouse children had, isolated from conventional society, but rich in experiences unique to their environment. The eldest daughter, Sarah, showed remarkable artistic talent and filled dozens of sketchbooks with drawings of the lighthouse, the sea, the cliffs, the changing skies, creating a visual record of lighthouse life that would later be recognized as having significant historical and artistic value. She captured in her drawings not just the physical environment but the emotional essence of the place, the stark beauty, the loneliness, the dignity of labor in service of others, the intimate relationship between human construction and natural forces. Her work would eventually be displayed in maritime museums, offering viewers a window into a way of life few would ever experience directly. The lighthouse faced its next major crisis in 1939, when global conflict erupted once again, bringing with it a return of the wartime protocols that had so troubled keeper Pemberton a generation earlier. Edmund Cross received orders similar to those his predecessor had followed, with the lighthouse now required to operate under blackout conditions unless specifically authorized to display its light. This meant that for extended periods, the lighthouse stood dark while war raged across the seas, its keeper maintaining equipment that could not be used, polishing lenses that projected no light, a situation that Cross found deeply distressing. He confided in his log entries that the darkened lighthouse felt like a betrayal of every keeper who had come before, every sailor who had depended on its light, every principle that the lighthouse represented. The conflict brought the war directly to the lighthouse's doorstep on multiple occasions, with hostile aircraft passing overhead, distant explosions visible on the horizon, and once, terrifyingly, a damaged vessel drifting past the promontory trailing smoke and fire. Its crew abandoning ship even as Cross watched helplessly, forbidden from lighting the beacon that might have helped them navigate to safety. The psychological toll of maintaining a darkened lighthouse while ships were in peril was severe, and Cross struggled with depression and a sense of purposelessness that threatened to overwhelm him. His wife Dorothy became his anchor during this period, reminding him that his duty was to preserve the lighthouse and its equipment, so that when peace returned, the light could shine again with full strength. The strategy proved prescient when, in 1944, the lighthouse was suddenly ordered to resume full operations, the military situation having changed in ways that made the light valuable for guiding friendly vessels through these waters. Cross relit the great lamp on an autumn evening, watching the beams sweep across waters that had been dark for nearly 3 years, and he recorded in his log that the moment felt like a resurrection, like the lighthouse had been returned to life after a period of death. The relief he felt was shared by merchant captains, who once again had the lighthouse as a navigational reference, and letters of gratitude began arriving at the lighthouse within weeks, thanking Cross for maintaining the equipment so well that the light could resume operation immediately when needed. The post-war years brought rapid technological change that would eventually transform lighthouse operations in fundamental ways. In 1952, during the tenure of Keeper Robert Halloran, the lighthouse received its first radio beacon transmitter, a device that broadcasted a distinctive signal that could be detected by ships equipped with radio direction-finding equipment, providing navigational assistance even in fog or conditions where the light itself might be obscured. The radio beacon represented a new category of technology, one that did not rely on direct visibility, but rather on electromagnetic radiation invisible to human senses, marking a shift from purely optical navigation aids to electronic systems. Halloran, who had received technical training during military service, adapted quickly to the new equipment, adding radio system maintenance to his already extensive list of duties. The radio beacon proved its worth immediately, with ship captains reporting that the ability to receive navigational signals regardless of visibility conditions significantly enhanced safety, especially during the frequent fog banks that rolled in from the sea during certain seasons. Yet even as electronic systems expanded, the lighthouse's fundamental purpose remained centered on its light, the brilliant beam that had swept across these waters for more than a century and a half, a light that no technology could make obsolete because it required no equipment aboard ships to be useful, serving as a navigational reference for any vessel with crew capable of seeing it. The 1960s and 70s brought discussions about automation, with advances in technology making it theoretically possible to operate lighthouses without keepers, using automatic lamp changing systems, remote monitoring, and solar panels to create self-sustaining installations that required only periodic maintenance visits. These discussions caused considerable concern among lighthouse keepers, many of whom saw automation not as progress, but as an abandonment of the human element that had always been central to lighthouse operations. Keeper James Morrison, who served from 1964 through 1983, was a vocal advocate for maintaining manned lighthouses, arguing that automated systems lacked the judgment, adaptability, and dedication that human keepers provided. He pointed to numerous instances in the lighthouse's history where keeper intervention had been crucial: emergency repairs during storms, assistance to shipwreck survivors, adaptations to unexpected equipment failures, decisions about whether to light or darken the beacon during wartime. Morrison argued persuasively that while automation might handle routine operations adequately, it would inevitably fail in precisely those emergency situations where lighthouse keepers had proven most valuable. His arguments carried weight with maritime authorities, and the lighthouse remained under keeper care throughout his tenure and beyond, even as other lighthouses in more accessible locations were converted to automatic operation. Morrison proved his point in spectacular fashion during a severe storm in 1977, when a combination of equipment failures and extreme weather conditions created a crisis that no automated system could have addressed. The primary lamp failed due to a power surge, the backup lamp's automatic switching mechanism malfunctioned, and the emergency communication systems were knocked out by lightning strike, leaving the lighthouse effectively isolated and dark. Working by flashlight in the lantern room while the storm raged outside, Morrison diagnosed multiple interconnected failures, fabricated jury-rigged solutions using whatever materials were available, and restored light to the lighthouse within 3 hours of the initial failure. During those 3 hours of darkness, 2 ships were navigating the area, their captains relying on the lighthouse to maintain safe distance from the rocks. When the light suddenly disappeared, both captains took immediate emergency actions, altering course to move away from the coast until they could determine what had happened. Morrison's rapid restoration of the light allowed both vessels to resume their intended courses without incident, but the captains later reported that had the light remained dark for much longer, the combination of storm conditions and position uncertainty would have forced them into dangerous alternative routes that might well have resulted in disaster. The incident was documented thoroughly, and Morrison's actions became yet another chapter in the lighthouse's history of human competence triumphing over technological failure. The 1980s and 90s saw continued pressure for automation, driven partly by budget considerations and partly by changing attitudes toward traditional maritime practices. The keeper position, once viewed as noble and essential, was increasingly seen by bureaucratic administrators as anachronistic, a a costly holdover from an earlier era that modern technology had rendered unnecessary. Several times during this period, proposals were put forward to automate the lighthouse and eliminate the keeper position, and each time these proposals were met with resistance from maritime professionals, local communities, and lighthouse advocacy organizations who valued the human presence at these critical installations. The debate became particularly intense in the early 90s, when budget pressures created strong incentives for cost-cutting measures, and the lighthouse found itself in the uncomfortable position of having to justify its traditional operating model against automated alternatives that appeared cheaper on paper. The keeper during this crucial period was a woman named Victoria Ashford, appointed in 1991 as the lighthouse's first female head keeper, bringing to the position an impressive resume that included degrees in marine engineering and meteorology, along with 15 years of experience as assistant keeper at various installations. Ashford's appointment itself represented a breakthrough in a profession that had been almost exclusively male since its inception, and she faced skepticism from some quarters about whether women could handle the physical and psychological demands of the role. She answered such doubts through exemplary performance, maintaining the lighthouse to standards that exceeded those of her predecessors, while also modernizing certain operational aspects and improving documentation systems. Ashford was also a skilled advocate for the lighthouse, writing detailed reports for maritime authorities that quantified the value of human presence at the installation, documenting incidents where keeper intervention had prevented problems, and making the case that the costs of automation, when properly accounting for equipment reliability, maintenance requirements, and emergency response capabilities, were not as favorable as simple budget comparisons suggested. Her advocacy helped secure the lighthouse's status as a manned installation through the 1990s and into the new millennium, though the pressure for automation never entirely disappeared. The lighthouse entered its third century of operation in the year 2002, an occasion marked by a ceremony attended by maritime officials, former keepers, descendants of keepers from earlier eras, and local residents who had come to view the lighthouse as part of their collective heritage. The structure had been maintained so well over 2 centuries that much of the original stonework remained intact. A testament to the quality of the original construction and the dedication of generations of keepers who had preserved it. The Fresnel lens installed in 1843 was still in operation, its prisms and glass elements as clear as the day they were ground, the brass fittings polished to a mirror shine. During the ceremony, maritime officials announced that the lighthouse had been designated as a protected historical structure, ensuring that it would be preserved regardless of any future decisions about automation or operational changes. Keeper Victoria Ashford, who presided over the ceremony, spoke about the lighthouse's history and meaning, describing it not just as a navigational aid, but as a symbol of humanity's commitment to looking out for one another, of the belief that we have an obligation to provide guidance to those navigating dangerous waters, both literally and metaphorically. Her speech resonated with the assembled crowd, many of whom had personal connections to the lighthouse or to maritime life in general, and the ceremony concluded with the traditional lighting of the beacon at dusk, the beam sweeping out across waters it had illuminated for 200 years. The early years of the new millennium brought technological capabilities that would have seemed like pure fantasy to the lighthouse's early keepers. GPS navigation systems provided ships with positional accuracy that was once unimaginable. Electronic charts displayed real-time information about position, course, speed, and nearby hazards. Radar could detect obstacles in total darkness or fog, and satellite communication systems allowed ships to maintain constant contact with shore authorities. These technologies fundamentally changed maritime navigation, reducing reliance on visual references like lighthouses, and leading some to question whether lighthouse beacons still served a necessary purpose in an age of electronic navigation. Yet maritime professionals consistently pointed out that electronic systems could fail due to power loss, software glitches, satellite outages, or equipment malfunctions, and when such failures occurred, traditional navigation methods including lighthouse beacons remained essential backups. The lighthouse beam was a technology that required no power aboard the vessel, no functioning equipment, no satellites in orbit, nothing more than functional eyesight and basic knowledge of navigation. It was, in essence, a fail-safe system that worked when everything else failed, and this redundancy gave it enduring value despite the sophistication of modern navigation technology. Keeper Ashford retired in 2009 after 18 years of service, and her replacement was a young man named Daniel Chen, aged 34, who brought to the position a unique combination of traditional maritime knowledge and expertise in modern electronic systems. Chen had served in the merchant marine for 10 years before seeking the keeper position, attracted by what he described as the purity of purpose inherent in lighthouse work. In an increasingly complex world, he appreciated the clarity of the keeper's mission: maintain the light, keep it burning, provide guidance to those who need it. Chen was also aware that he might be among the last generation of lighthouse keepers, as automation technology continued to improve and economic pressures continued to favor unmanned operations. He approached his role with a sense of historical consciousness, understanding that he was part of a tradition stretching back more than 2 centuries, and he committed himself to maintaining that tradition with the same excellence demonstrated by all the keepers who had come before him. The lighthouse underwent a significant equipment upgrade during Chen's early tenure, with the installation of a modern LED lamp system that provided light output equivalent to the traditional lamp while consuming a fraction of the power. The LED system also offered unprecedented reliability, with expected operational lifespan measured in decades rather than months, and redundant arrays that made total failure virtually impossible. The installation of this system in 2011 sparked debate among lighthouse historians and preservationists, some of whom felt that replacing the traditional lamp system, even with a more efficient alternative, represented a loss of historical authenticity. Chen understood these concerns, but argued that the lighthouse's mission had always been about providing the best possible light using the best available technology, and that upgrading the lamp system was entirely consistent with that mission. He also ensured that the older lamp systems were carefully preserved rather than discarded, maintaining them in working condition so that they could serve as backups or potentially be reinstalled if future circumstances warranted. The LED lamp was first illuminated on a winter evening in December 2011, its brilliant beams sweeping across waves that countless earlier beams had illuminated using oil flames, vapor lamps, and incandescent bulbs. The continuity of purpose across changing technology was striking. The light still shone, the beam still rotated with its distinctive 40-second pattern, the lighthouse still served its ancient function, even as the means of producing light had evolved through multiple generations of technology. Chen recorded the moment in the lighthouse log, now maintained both in traditional handwritten form and in digital format, noting that while the technology had changed, the commitment remained identical to that demonstrated by Thomas Brennan when he lit the first lamp more than 2 centuries earlier. The question of automation resurfaced with renewed intensity in 2015, when maritime authorities conducted a comprehensive review of lighthouse operations across the entire coastal region. The review examined costs, reliability, safety records, and operational efficiency, comparing manned lighthouses against automated installations and seeking to develop recommendations for future operations. Keeper Chen participated extensively in this review process, providing detailed documentation of his duties and activities, explaining the full scope of what lighthouse keepers actually did beyond simply maintaining the lamp. His testimony revealed that keepers served multiple functions. They monitored weather and reported unusual conditions. They maintained not just the light but the entire facility, including buildings and grounds. They provided emergency assistance during maritime incidents. They served as representatives of maritime authority in remote locations. They collected environmental data. They performed equipment maintenance and minor repairs that would otherwise require expensive service calls. And they provided an invaluable human presence that represented continuity, local knowledge, and adaptability. The review committee's final report, published in 2016, concluded that while automation was appropriate for many lighthouses, certain installations, including this particular lighthouse, should remain under keeper care due to their historical significance, remote location, harsh operating environment, and proven record of keeper contributions to maritime safety. The recommendation provided a reprieve for traditional lighthouse keeping at this location, though it came with the acknowledgement that ongoing reviews would continue and that nothing was guaranteed in perpetuity. Chen received the news with relief, but also with awareness that each successive keeper would need to continue demonstrating value to preserve the position. The years that followed saw Chen establish himself as not just a keeper, but as a guardian of lighthouse history and tradition. He began conducting extensive research into the lighthouse's past, digitizing the handwritten logs that stretched back to 1802, creating a searchable database that allowed historians and researchers to access more than 2 centuries of daily observations, weather records, ship sightings, and keeper notes. This project consumed hundreds of hours of work during his off-duty time, but Chen felt it was essential to preserve this detailed historical record that documented not just the lighthouse's operations, but also changing weather patterns, maritime traffic evolution, technological progression, and the lived experiences of generations of keepers and their families. The digitized logs revealed patterns that had been invisible when the records existed only as individual handwritten volumes. long-term climate trends, seasonal variations in shipping traffic, the gradual improvement in maritime safety as navigation technology advanced, and the remarkably consistent dedication of keepers across different eras and circumstances. Researchers began using this data for various studies, including climate science investigations that found value in the continuous weather observations recorded by keepers over more than 200 years, providing a rare example of consistent long-term environmental data from a single location. Chen also opened the lighthouse to occasional public tour, carefully managed to ensure they did not interfere with operational duties, allowing people to see firsthand what lighthouse keeping entailed and to experience the environment that keepers inhabited. These tours generated significant public interest and support for maintaining the lighthouse as a manned installation, as visitors gained appreciation for the complexity of the keeper's role and the historical significance of the tradition. Among the tour visitors were school groups whose students learned about maritime history, navigation, optics, weather science, and the importance of service to others. Teachers reported that visits to the lighthouse had profound impacts on students, many of whom had never considered that such places still existed or that people still maintained them, and who came away with expanded awareness of the unseen infrastructure and human effort that supported modern society. The lighthouse also hosted occasional visits from descendants of former keepers, emotional homecomings for people whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents had lived and worked at this remote promontory. These visits often included tearful reunions with a place that existed in family stories and memories, with visitors walking through the keepers' quarters where their ancestors had lived, climbing the tower stairs worn smooth by generations of feet, standing in the lantern room where their forebears had maintained the light through storms and calm. Chen facilitated these visits with sensitivity and respect, understanding that for these families, the lighthouse was not just a historical structure, but a deeply personal place connected to their own identities and family histories. One particularly moving visit involved an elderly woman named Helen Morrison, granddaughter of Keeper James Morrison, who had served from 1964 to 1983. Helen had been a young girl during some of her grandfather's tenure and had vivid memories of summers spent at the lighthouse, memories that she had treasured throughout her life, but had never had opportunity to revisit until Chen's invitation brought her back at age 72. Walking through the lighthouse with Chen, Helen shared stories her grandfather had told her, stories that Chen was able to verify and expand upon using the historical logs. She showed him the exact spot on the cliff path where she had once found a seal pup, the window in the keeper's quarters where she had watched storms roll in from the sea, the workbench in the tower's base where her grandfather had taught her to use hand tools and to understand mechanical systems. For Helen, the visit was a reconnection with her grandfather, who had passed away many years earlier, and with a part of her own childhood that had shaped her in ways she had never fully articulated. For Chen, the visit reinforced his understanding that the lighthouse's significance extended far beyond its navigational function, that it held meaning in human lives in ways that could never be captured in operational reports or efficiency analyses. The lighthouse faced a new and unexpected challenge in 2018 when a severe storm, the most powerful to strike this coast in more than 50 years, subjected the structure to forces that exceeded anything in the historical record. The storm developed rapidly, with meteorological services providing only 18 hours of warning before winds exceeding 170 kilometers per hour began battering the promontory. Chen initiated emergency protocols, securing equipment and supplies, reinforcing vulnerable elements of the structure, and preparing for an extended period of isolation as the storm would make any access to or from the lighthouse impossible. The storm arrived at midday, unusual for severe weather systems in this region which typically intensified during nighttime hours, and from the moment it struck, Chen knew this would be an unprecedented test. Waves reached heights estimated at 25 to 30 meters, crashing against the cliffs with such force that the entire promontory shook. Spray reached the lantern room despite its 42-meter elevation, and the wind produced a roar so loud that Chen could barely hear the sound of equipment inside the tower, even when standing directly next to it. The structural integrity of the lighthouse, built to withstand extreme conditions but never tested at this level of intensity, became Chen's primary concern as the storm continued to intensify throughout the afternoon. He monitored the tower for any signs of stress or damage, checking for cracks in masonry, movement in the lens mechanism, water penetration through window seals, and any indication that the structure might be approaching its limits. For 6 hours, the storm maintained peak intensity, and during this period Chen remained in the lantern room, unable to descend due to the danger of being on the tower stairs during the most violent conditions, committed to maintaining the light and ready to implement emergency measures if structural failure seemed imminent. The experience was terrifying in ways that Chen had difficulty articulating afterward, as the combination of sound, vibration, and visible fury of waves and wind created a sensory environment that seemed apocalyptic. Yet even as fear gripped him, Chen maintained his duties, monitoring the lamp, adjusting ventilation to prevent moisture buildup, and documenting conditions in the log with hands that shook from cold and adrenaline. The light never flickered, never dimmed, continued its steady rotation throughout the entire ordeal, a defiant human-made beacon standing against nature's full fury. When the storm finally began to abate after nightfall, Chen descended from the lantern room on legs weak from exhaustion and stress, conducting a comprehensive inspection of the lighthouse that revealed damage but not catastrophic failure. Several windows had cracked, water had penetrated into some lower spaces requiring cleanup and drying, minor structural cracks had appeared in some exterior stonework, and various equipment had been damaged by the extreme conditions, but the core integrity of the tower remained sound, the light continued operating, and the lighthouse had survived. Chen's report on the storm, filed once communication systems were restored 2 days later, provided a detailed account of the most severe conditions the lighthouse had experienced in its 216-year history, and his calm professionalism throughout the crisis earned commendation from maritime authorities. The storm also provided vindication for those who had argued that human keepers remained essential, as Chen's presence had allowed immediate response to developing problems, emergency repairs that prevented minor damage from becoming major failures, and real-time assessment of structural integrity that remote monitoring systems could never provide. In the aftermath of the storm, engineering teams conducted thorough inspections of the lighthouse, making repairs and upgrades to strengthen the structure against future extreme weather events. The work took 3 months and required Chen to temporarily relocate, while construction crews worked on the most extensive renovations since the lighthouse's original construction. The engineers expressed amazement at the quality of the original 1802 construction, noting that stonework more than 2 centuries old had withstood forces that would have destroyed many modern structures, a testament to the skill of Marcus Aldworth and the craftsmen who built the lighthouse using techniques and materials whose quality had not been equaled by contemporary methods. The repairs and upgrades included reinforcement of window frames with impact-resistant materials, installation of additional drainage systems to handle water intrusion, strengthening of roof connections, and seismic upgrades that would help the structure withstand not just storms, but also potential earthquake activity. When Chen returned to the lighthouse after the renovation, he found a structure that retained its historical character while being better equipped to face future challenges, a blending of preservation and adaptation that seemed appropriate for a lighthouse that had always balanced tradition with necessary evolution. The 2020s brought new discussions about the lighthouse's future, as maritime authorities once again examined their operations in light of budget pressures and changing technology. The conversation had shifted somewhat from earlier debates, with less emphasis on complete automation and more focus on potential hybrid models, where lighthouses might be automated for routine operations, but retain human keepers on call for emergencies or periodic maintenance. Chen participated in these discussions, arguing that such hybrid models would sacrifice many of the benefits that full-time keepers provided while retaining most of the costs, creating a worst-of-both-worlds situation. He pointed out that many keeper functions required continuous presence, whether monitoring, facility maintenance, emergency response readiness, public education, historical preservation, and that periodic visits by maintenance technicians could not replicate these functions adequately. The debate remained unresolved as of 2023 when a new maritime administrator took office with a stated commitment to preserving traditional lighthouse operations at historically significant sites. This administrator, who had personal family connections to maritime history, understood the cultural and symbolic importance of manned lighthouses beyond their purely utilitarian navigation function. Under this administration's leadership, the lighthouse received guaranteed funding for keeper operations through at least 2030, providing stability that allowed Chen to plan long-term preservation and education initiatives without the constant uncertainty about whether his position would be eliminated. Chen used this security to expand public programs, developing educational materials about lighthouse history and operations, establishing a small museum in one section of the keeper's dwelling that displayed artifacts and documents from the lighthouse's past, and creating a digital archive that made lighthouse history accessible to anyone with internet access. These initiatives transformed the lighthouse from being simply an operational navigation aid into being also a cultural and educational resource, serving functions that extended well beyond its original purpose while never compromising that purpose. The light continued to shine every night, maintained with the same dedication that had characterized its operation for more than 200 years, but now the lighthouse also served as a teaching tool, a historical monument, and a symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Chen also established connections with other lighthouse keepers around the world, building a network of professionals who shared experiences, knowledge, and support. This global lighthouse community, connected through internet communications that would have astounded earlier generations of keepers, shared technical information, discussed common challenges, and provided mutual encouragement in maintaining a tradition that many viewed as increasingly anachronistic. Through this network, Chen learned about lighthouses in distant regions that faced similar pressures toward automation, about keepers who had developed innovative solutions to maintenance challenges, about preservation efforts at historic installations, and about the surprising resilience of traditional lighthouse keeping despite decades of predictions about its imminent obsolescence. The network also organized occasional gatherings where keepers could meet in person, share stories, and strengthen bonds that were usually maintained only through electronic communication. Chen attended one such gathering in 2024, traveling to a location where more than 40 lighthouse keepers from various regions assembled for 3 days of presentations, workshops, and camaraderie. The experience was profound for Chen, who had spent years working in isolation, rarely encountering others who truly understood the unique nature of lighthouse keeping. Hearing other keepers describe their experiences, challenges, and dedication reinforced his sense of being part of something larger than himself, a global community united by shared purpose, despite vast differences in geography, culture, and circumstance. One keeper from a remote installation spoke about maintaining a light in conditions of extreme cold, where temperatures could drop to -40 degrees, where ice accumulation on the tower required daily chipping and removal, where winter darkness lasted for months. Another described keeping a light in tropical conditions with constant heat and humidity, with challenges from salt corrosion and frequent tropical storms. A third spoke about a lighthouse accessible only by helicopter or boat, where supply deliveries occurred monthly at best, and where the keeper's family had lived for 5 years without setting foot on the mainland. Despite the vast differences in their circumstances, all shared the fundamental commitment to maintaining their lights, the same commitment that had driven Thomas Brennan in 1802 and every keeper since. The gathering concluded with a traditional ceremony where each keeper in attendance lit a small lamp, symbolic of the lights they maintained. And the room filled with the warm glow of dozens of flames, a moving reminder that across the world's coasts, lights were shining because dedicated individuals had chosen to keep them lit. Chen returned to his lighthouse with renewed appreciation for his role and his place in this global tradition, carrying with him stories and friendships that would sustain him through the isolation of his daily work. The lighthouse in 2025, now 223 years old, stood as one of the few remaining manned lighthouses in the region, a survivor of automation trends that had eliminated keeper positions at most installations. Its survival owed to multiple factors: its historical significance as one of the oldest continuously operated lighthouses, its location in challenging environmental conditions where human presence provided operational advantages, its role as an educational and cultural resource, and the succession of skilled keepers who had demonstrated consistently that their presence added value beyond what automation could provide. Yet Chen understood that survival was not guaranteed, that each year might bring new pressures or changing priorities that could threaten the traditional keeper position. He approached his work with awareness that he might be among the last keepers, that the tradition stretching back more than 2 centuries might end during his lifetime or shortly after, and this awareness added poignancy to his daily routines. Each time he climbed the tower stairs, cleaned the lens, lit the lamp, recorded observations in the log, he did so with consciousness that he was performing rituals that might not be performed by future generations, that the knowledge and skills he employed might become historical curiosities rather than living practices. This sense of potential ending made Chen even more committed to documentation and preservation, to ensuring that if traditional lighthouse keeping did end, at least its history and significance would be thoroughly recorded and understood. The lighthouse had witnessed extraordinary changes during its 2-century existence. Sailing ships had given way to steam power, then to diesel and nuclear propulsion. Wooden hulls had been replaced by steel and composites. Navigation had evolved from celestial observation and dead reckoning to radio direction, finding to GPS satellite systems. Communication had progressed from isolation and quarterly mail deliveries to instant global connectivity. Yet through all these changes, the fundamental purpose had remained constant: provide light to guide those navigating dangerous waters. This constancy of purpose amid changing context gave the lighthouse a quality that Chen thought of as timeless, a sense that it existed somewhat outside the normal flow of history, even while being very much part of that history. Visitors to the lighthouse often commented on this quality, describing a feeling that time moved differently there, that the modern world's frantic pace seemed distant and irrelevant when standing in the lantern room watching the beam sweep across ancient waters. Chen understood this feeling, had experienced it himself countless times, and he believed it was one of the lighthouse's most valuable but least quantifiable attributes. In an age of constant change and disruption, the lighthouse offered continuity and stability, a reminder that some things endure, that not everything must be constantly reimagined and reinvented, that there is value in maintaining traditions and practices that have proven their worth across generations. This perspective was increasingly countercultural in a society that often valued novelty over continuity, that frequently dismissed traditional practices as outdated without carefully considering what might be lost in abandoning them. The lighthouse stood as a quiet argument for preservation, for maintaining connections to the past, for honoring the work and dedication of those who came before, and Chen saw his role as including responsibility to articulate and defend these values when they came under challenge. As 2025 progressed, Chen continued his duties with the same dedication that had characterized keepers throughout the lighthouse's history, maintaining the light, monitoring conditions, documenting observations, assisting mariners when needed, preserving the facility, educating visitors, and adding his own chapter to the ongoing story. He understood that he was one link in a long chain, that his work connected directly to that of Thomas Brennan and David Carrick and Jonathan Carrick and William Thatcher and Richard Pemberton and Edmund Cross, and all the others who had kept this light burning through more than 2 centuries of changing circumstances and unchanging purpose. On clear nights, when the lighthouse beam swept across calm waters reflecting stars, Chen sometimes thought about those earlier keepers, about their lives and sacrifices and dedication, about the countless nights they had performed these same duties, about the continuity of purpose that connected him to them across the centuries. He wondered whether they would approve of how he maintained the lighthouse, whether they would find comfort in knowing their work had endured, whether they would be pleased that the tradition they helped establish had been preserved despite pressures to abandon it. He liked to think they would approve, that there would be recognition and respect across the temporal distance, keeper to keeper, sharers of an experience that few others could truly understand. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation, 40 seconds per cycle, the same timing that had characterized its pattern since 1802, a constancy that ship's captains could depend upon, that had become part of the navigational signature of these waters, that represented reliability in a world where so much was uncertain. Every night as darkness fell, Chen climbed to the lantern room, performed his checks and adjustments, and watched the lamp come to life, watched the beam begin its sweep across the darkening waters, and every night he felt the weight and privilege of his responsibility. This was not just a job or a role, but a calling, a commitment that demanded everything and offered rewards that could not be measured in conventional terms. The satisfaction came not from recognition or compensation, but from the knowledge that the work mattered, that the light he maintained might mean the difference between safe passage and disaster for ships he would never see, for sailors he would never meet, for people whose lives intersected with his only through the medium of a light beam sweeping across water. This was service in its purest form, work performed not for personal benefit, but for the welfare of others, labor that continued regardless of whether anyone noticed or appreciated it. Dedication sustained by internal conviction rather than external validation. Chen had come to understand that this quality of selfless service was perhaps the most important tradition the lighthouse represented, more significant even than the technical knowledge or the historical continuity. The lighthouse stood as a monument to the principle that we have obligations to one another, that we must maintain lights for those navigating dangerous passages, that some things must be kept burning regardless of cost or convenience, that there are responsibilities that transcend individual interest and demand fulfillment simply because they are right and necessary. These were not fashionable ideas in an age increasingly characterized by self-interest and transactional relationships, but Chen believed they were essential truths that the lighthouse embodied and that his work helped preserve. The story of the lighthouse, spanning more than 2 centuries and continuing into an uncertain future, was ultimately a story about human character, about the capacity for dedication and sacrifice, about the willingness to serve purposes larger than oneself, about the determination to maintain standards of excellence even when no one is watching, about the courage to face danger when duty demands it, and about the persistence to continue work that might seem futile or anachronistic to those who do not understand its deeper significance. Every keeper who had served this lighthouse had faced challenges unique to their era. Thomas Brennan building new traditions in isolation, David Carrick fighting through storms that threatened to destroy the light, Jonathan Carrick developing innovations to improve operations, William Thatcher's meticulous attention preventing catastrophic failures, Richard Pemberton wrestling with moral dilemmas during wartime, Edmund Cross maintaining equipment he could not use while conflict raged. James Morrison proving human superiority over automation in crisis situations, Victoria Ashford breaking gender barriers while defending the keeper tradition, and Daniel Chen preserving history while navigating contemporary pressures toward automation. Each had faced their challenges with courage and competence, each had maintained the light through their respective trials, each had passed the responsibility to their successor intact and operational, and the unbroken chain of service stretched across generations, connecting past to present and extending toward a future that remained unwritten. As Chen looked toward that future, he knew uncertainty would continue, that debates about the lighthouse's operation would recur, that economic and technological pressures would persist, that the tradition of manned lighthouse keeping would face ongoing challenges. But he also knew that as long as there were people who understood the lighthouse's significance, who valued its history and its symbolism, who recognized that some lights must never go dark, there would be advocates for preserving this tradition. The lighthouse had survived storms and wars, equipment failures and budget cuts, changing technologies and shifting priorities, emerging from each challenge with its light still burning, and this resilience suggested that it might yet endure for generations to come. The beam swept across the waters as it had for 223 years, as it might for 200 more, a constant presence in an inconstant world, a light that never went dark because people like Daniel Chen, following in the footsteps of generations of dedicated keepers, refused to let it die, understood its importance too deeply to abandon it, and committed themselves wholly to the simple but profound purpose of keeping the light burning so that others might find their way safely home. This was the lighthouse's story, and it was also humanity's story in miniature, a testament to our capacity for dedication, our willingness to serve one another, our ability to maintain purpose across changing circumstances, and our determination to preserve what matters despite all obstacles and pressures. The lighthouse stood, the light shone, the beam swept across ancient waters, and somewhere in the darkness, a ship's captain saw that light and adjusted course accordingly, guided by a beam maintained by a keeper who would never know that captain's name, never receive thanks for preventing a disaster that would never occur, never hear appreciation for work performed in obscurity and isolation. But the captain saw the light, made safe passage, and continued toward destination. And in that moment the lighthouse fulfilled its purpose as it had countless millions of times before, as it would continue to do so long as keepers remained willing to climb the tower stairs, maintain the lamp and keep the light burning through every night until dawn made it unnecessary, then repeat the cycle again when darkness returned, forever vigilant, forever dedicated, forever serving those who navigate dangerous waters. Forever standing as a symbol that some lights must never, ever go dark.